My name? It doesn't matter. Not really. What matters, what I can't get out of my head, is what I saw that Tuesday, and the absolute nightmare it started. Zinnia hit the doors of Marcello's Bistro at 6:47 a.m. sharp, every single morning. This wasn't about being some star employee, God no. This was raw survival. One write-up. She was out. No job meant no daycare. No daycare meant her little girl, Azaria, would be completely adrift. And Zinnia would burn the world down before she let that happen. Look, these stories, they always boil down to the exact same thing: sacrifice. It's about powerful, fragile men terrified of losing control, and women who flat out refuse to surrender their dignity. If you're here for that kind of real, heavy tension, take a second. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because it's about to get dark. But that Tuesday, life didn't just throw a wrench in the gears, it shattered them. A blast text at 5 a.m. The daycare was closed. Health inspection. 2 hours notice. Zinnia had zero backup. She was completely out of favors. Just her and a tired 4-year-old clutching this raggedy little stuffed rabbit named Biscuit. So she did the only thing she could do. She brought her baby to work. Stu, the manager, he gave her that look. You know the one. That arrogant, dismissive face men make when they're too lazy to lift a finger, but just inconvenienced enough to be absolute pricks about it. He gave her an hour to figure it out. She took it. She tucked little Azaria into a back corner booth with a grilled cheese and a crinkled box of apple juice, tied her apron with shaking hands, then went out there. I just watched her move. She worked that diner floor like she was carrying a literal boulder on her shoulders, but she completely refused to let her knees buckle. She forced smiles for the regulars. She poured coffee before anyone even asked. And every single time she passed the kitchen doors, her eyes darted to Azaria, like she was desperately trying to keep two fragile worlds spinning at the exact same time. And then, the kid started crying. It wasn't a tantrum, no. It was that quiet, shaky lip kind of sobbing that just tears your heart right out of your chest because it's so desperately controlled. Azaria just looked up at her mom and whispered something. I couldn't hear it from the counter, but the pain in it was deafening. Zinnia was mid-sentence taking an order, but she just stopped. She dropped everything. She walked over and sank into a hard crouch right there on the greasy linoleum. She didn't care who was staring. She didn't care about Stu. She just closed her eyes and started to hum. It was so low, so deeply private. And then she started to sing. Half in English, half in this beautiful ancient language that sounded like it had bled across 1,000 miles just to wrap around that tiny booth. Hush now. The world ain't going nowhere. Stay right here. You're already home. The diner didn't stop. Idiots kept chewing. Phones kept buzzing. The cruel world just kept turning. Nobody else realized that something huge, something fundamental, had just shifted in the air. Not until the front door opened. 3 men walked in, dressed in black, moving with that terrifying, heavy silence that always means violence. The guy in the middle, he stopped dead in his tracks. He just stood there, planted in the dead center of the room, and listened. His name was Giovanni Rizzo. I didn't know that then. I found out later. You know, the way you find out everything in a town like Crestfield, quietly, and usually with this cold, sinking feeling right in the pit of your gut. The 2 gorillas flanking him, they looked completely lost. I mean, they were trained for a lot of things, but boss stopping in a greasy spoon to listen to a lullaby? Yeah, that wasn't on the list. Zinnia hadn't even noticed them. She was just completely in her own world. her hand gently resting on the back of her little girl's chair. Azaria had finally gone still, her breathing, thank God, finally leveling out. It was beautiful, really. Like that song had just reached out and stitched something broken right back together inside the kid. Giovanni watched the whole thing. And I was the only one watching him. Look, I've spent enough time behind counters to recognize dangerous when I see it. And let me tell you, it's not always a snarl or a drawn weapon. Sometimes it's just a man whose face goes completely, terrifyingly blank. Because he's seeing something he didn't think existed anymore. He'd come to collect. God, I know that now, too. Stu owed people, the kind of people who don't send past due notices. Giovanni had walked in there to end a conversation, plain and simple. But then, he heard her sing. When Zinnia finally stood up and turned around, she found all three of these men just staring at her. And she didn't flinch, not even a little. She didn't apologize for the kid crying. She didn't scramble back to work. She just looked Giovanni right in his dead eyes, exhausted, but so incredibly steady, and said, "I'll be right with you." Giovanni slowly leaned toward the guy on his left and muttered something low. The guy looked confused, almost shocked. So Giovanni said it again. I was just close enough to catch it that second time. A chill went right down my spine. "Bring her to me," he said. To this day, I still don't know if that was the start of a miracle for Zinnia, or the exact moment her life truly went off the rails. Nobody at Marcello's talked about what went down at that corner table. It wasn't because they missed it. I mean, everyone was staring, holding their breath, but because in this town, you learn real quick that keeping your mouth shut is the only way you survive. I watched the whole 40 minutes from behind the counter. My stomach was in knots. Giovanni sat across from Zinnia like he had all the time in the world. And if you knew anything about the man, that was the most terrifying part. His two shadows were hovering 10 feet away, shifting on their feet, looking like they didn't know what to do with their hands. Back by the kitchen, Stu kept popping his head out, his face pale. I swear I thought he was either going to drop dead of a heart attack or just bolt for the alley. But the part that actually floored me, the part that still gives me chills? Giovanni talked to the kid first. He leaned in, rested his elbows on the table, and asked the little girl what her rabbit's name was. Azaria gave him that long, squinty, more skeptical look that only kids can pull off when they aren't sure about you yet. Finally, she muttered, "Biscuit." Giovanni just nodded, dead serious, like she'd just handed him the launch codes. And then, she offered him a corner of her grilled cheese, and he actually took a bite. I can't even explain why that hit me so hard. But seeing the most dangerous man in Crestfield, a guy who could ruin your life with a phone call, eating a toddler's cold leftovers. Something heavy shifted in the air in that diner. He didn't talk business with Zinnia, not a word. He asked about the song, where she'd picked it up. He asked about her grandmother, about Trinidad. And he listened to her. Not just politely, but the way a man listens when he suddenly remembered something beautiful. Something he spent a whole decade trying to forget. When he finally stood up to leave, he quietly slid an envelope onto the table. $3,000 in cold cash, and a torn scrap of paper that just read, "For the daycare." No strings. Gr. Zinnia just stared at it. She didn't look relieved. She didn't look happy. She looked torn, like her heart was breaking, but her spine was made of steel. 10 minutes later, I watched her march straight out to the parking lot. Her hands must have been shaking, but she shoved that envelope right into Sal's chest. She'd tucked her own handwritten note inside. I found out later what it said. It read, "I can't take this, not because I don't need it, but because I need to be the kind of mother she can actually look up to." Zinnia. Sal read it twice. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable, and got in the car without a single word. I remember standing there, my breath caught in my throat, thinking, this woman is either the absolute bravest person in this town, or the most cursed. She'd just looked the king of Crestfield in the eye, handed him his charity back, and then walked right back inside to finish her shift, like it was just another Tuesday. I wasn't in the car when Giovanni got the news. I wish I was. But I wasn't. But Sal told me about it later, in that quiet, heavy, almost broken way men talk when they finally decide they trust you. He said Giovanni read Zinnia's note twice on the drive back. He just stared at it. Then he folded it. So slow, so careful, and tucked it into his inside coat pocket, right over his chest. He didn't say a single word for 30 miles, not a breath. And Sal, in 20 years of driving that man, Sal knew that kind of silence wasn't anger. It was grief. It was something way, way older. See, what people don't know, what almost nobody left alive remembers, is that Giovanni Rizzo used to have a daughter. Her name was Sarah. Her mother, Caterina, always used to say she looked like she was made of sunlight. She only ever wanted to wear yellow, just this bright running flash of yellow. She was 4 years old, exactly Azaria's age, when the fever hit. And it was fast. God, it was the kind of fast that doesn't even give you time to say goodbye. The kind where you don't even realize the world is ending until it's already over. Caterina called Giovanni 4 times that night. 4 times. She called him while Sarah was slipping away, while the doctors were starting to look at the floor instead of looking her in the eye. He didn't pick up. He was handling business. By the time he finally walked into that hospital wing, it was already over. Everything that actually mattered in his life was just gone. He stood in the hallway outside her room for 11 minutes. Sal timed it. 11 minutes of standing perfectly, terrifyingly still. Then he just turned, walked out, got in the car, and spent the next 3 hours giving orders, like his heart hadn't just been ripped straight out of his chest. Caterina left him 6 months later. There was no screaming, no lawyers. She just packed a single bag and vanished while he was in a meeting. He came home to this dead, silent house, and their wedding photo, sitting face down on the cold kitchen counter. He never picked it up. He never said her name again. Not once. Sarah became this ghost, a secret he kept locked behind his teeth. For 11 years, that was it. That was the end of the story. He'd built a wall around that memory so thick, so high, he almost believed it had worked. Until a waitress in a cheap diner started singing a lullaby from across the ocean. And she found the one door he'd forgotten to lock. 10 days went by before he showed his face again. And I know, because I was counting every single one of them. It wasn't that I was looking for him specifically. It's just that after what went down at that corner table, the whole place had been holding its collective breath. Stu was aggressively scrubbing counters that were already spotless. The other girls? They stopped gossiping by the kitchen pass. Even the regulars seemed to gulp their coffee, heads down, just trying to get out faster than usual. Then, on a Thursday, the bell over the door chimed. No Sal, no Breck, no wall of guys in black suits, just Giovanni Rizzo, alone, wearing a coat that probably cost more than Zinnia makes in an entire year. He sat at that corner table like he'd already bought the deed to the place. Stu scrambled out from the back in record time, but Giovanni gave him one look, just one look, and Stu vanished. Zinnia was working the floor. She spotted him the second he sat down, but she didn't rush over. She took her time. She finished her round at table 7. She topped off the coffee at table 2. Checked the ticket for 9. Only then did she walk over with her notepad, treating the most dangerous man in Crestfield like any other guy off the street. She asked for his order. He said coffee, and then he asked if she had 10 minutes to spare. Oh, she didn't even blink. She told him she had 7. I couldn't catch every word. The diner's never quite that still, but I caught enough to feel the air just drop. He told her he'd had a daughter once, and that she was gone. He told her that the song she sang to Azaria, it hit something inside him that he hadn't felt in a lifetime. He wasn't looking for pity. You could hear it in his voice. He was just laying out the raw truth, like a man who'd been carrying a heavy trunk for 20 miles, and finally needed to set it down. And Zinnia? She just listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer any empty platitudes. When he finally stood up to leave, he dropped $20 on the table for a $4 cup of coffee and walked out without looking back. But he'd be back, somewhere behind that calm, unbreakable face of hers. I think Zinnia already knew it. Pause for a beat here before the outro. You see, somewhere in this mess, people are making impossible choices between their pride and the people they love. If you think sacrifice is what actually reveals a person's true hand, hit that subscribe button. Stick around for the stories that actually get under your skin. While Giovanni was actually busy trying to remember how to be a human being, someone else was busy making the absolute biggest mistake of his life. Corvin Dash, just a mid-level loudmouth who somehow confused not getting caught yet with being a genius. He'd been running this greasy side hustle through the back hallway of Marcello's for months, moving packages that definitely weren't cannolis, right in that tiny 11-minute window between the lunch rush and the afternoon prep. Nobody official knew. But out here? Official is a very flexible word. Zinnia was just back there doing inventory on a random Wednesday when Corvin's runner, this twitchy, nervous kid named Ren, burst through the delivery door mid-handshake. It was bad timing. The absolute wrong day. Ren froze. The guy he was meeting froze. Zinnia. She just slowly looked up from her clipboard. She took it all in with one quiet sweep of her eyes. The heavy bag. The cash. The sheer panic of 2 men who had just been caught doing exactly what they shouldn't. And then, she just looked back down at her list and kept writing. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She didn't say a single word. But Ren had seen her face in those 3 agonizing seconds, and he didn't see fear. He saw that she knew. She completely understood the game, and even if she wasn't the one playing it, Ren ran straight to Corvin within the hour. Panic makes people stupid. And Corvin? He didn't even stop to think. Men like him, they calculate fast, and they calculate sloppy. To him, a witness is just a loose thread. You pull it until it's gone. He just told Ren to handle it quietly, and went about his night like he hadn't just casually signed a young mother's death warrant. But what Corvin didn't account for, the one thing a guy like him would never even consider, was Sal. Sal had been coming in every single Tuesday for the soup, not because he was ordered to, just because the soup was decent, the corner was quiet, and maybe, just maybe, because he'd started keeping a quiet eye on a certain waitress, just to make sure she made it to the end of her shift in one piece, that Wednesday. Sal wasn't there, but Tuesday was only 6 days away. And in Crestfield, a whole lot of awful can happen in 6 days. I had to piece that night together, from 2 different guys who only had half the story. Sal called Giovanni at exactly 11:47 p.m. I know the exact time because when Sal told me the story, he repeated it like a guy trying to prove how fast the whole thing went down. He said Giovanni listened, asked one single question, and then the line went dead quiet. For 4 long seconds. Then Giovanni finally spoke. "I'm going myself." Sal swore to me. He hadn't heard those 3 words come out of his boss's mouth in 20 years. Giovanni made 3 calls in 12 minutes. He redirected 2 of his guys and completely derailed an operation that was already moving. By 12:30 a.m., he was pulling up to a brick-and-mortar apartment complex in Crestfield, walking up 2 flights of stairs, and knocking on a door he had absolutely no business being at. Zinnia answered the door, holding an aluminum baseball bat. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't panicking. She held it with both hands, angled just right. It was the stance of a woman who had already made peace with what she was about to do to whoever was on the other side. He told me later. She was the most terrifyingly prepared person he'd ever stood in front of. "I know who you are," she said. "Why are you at my door at midnight?" He didn't sugarcoat it. He told her flat out that someone had made a move against her. It was handled, but she needed to get Azaria somewhere safe for 72 hours, while he made sure every loose end was tied off. "You handled it," she repeated. Her voice was dead level. "Yes. What does that mean? You're safer not knowing." This is the part of the story I keep turning over in my head, because she didn't argue. She didn't press him for bloody details. She just looked at him, really studied him. With this expression I can't even fully describe. It wasn't fear, and it sure as hell wasn't gratitude. It was something older, deeper than that. "Giovanni," she said. He told me the way she said his name hit him right under the ribs, and just stayed there. "Is my daughter safe tonight?" she asked. "Yes." "Then thank you," she said, and started to shut the door. "Zinnia." She stopped. And right there in the hallway, he said the most honest thing he'd spoken out loud in 11 years. "I don't know how to be around someone like you. Without wanting things I don't have the right to want." The hallway went dead silent. She didn't shut the door, but she didn't open it any wider either. She just stood there in the doorway, looking back at him. "Then figure out if you're willing to become a man who does." And she closed the door. He stood out there in the hallway much longer than he should have, the whole building keeping quiet around him, like it understood exactly what had just happened. Sal didn't say a word on the drive back. Neither did Giovanni. Just dead silence. I've spent hours trying to picture that black car, just gliding through Crestfield at 1 in the morning. Nothing but gray streets, locked storefronts, and maybe one single, lonely yellow light burning in an apartment above a laundromat. 2 of the most dangerous men in the city, I'm sitting in absolute, suffocating silence. Why? Because one of them had just confessed his naked soul to a single mother holding an aluminum bat. Sal told me later that he just stared at the road, kept his thoughts locked down tight. For a guy like Sal, letting a man bleed out his demons in quiet, that's the absolute highest form of respect he knows how to offer. Somewhere on that dark stretch of highway, Giovanni reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out that crumpled little note, the one Zinnia had written 3 weeks back. He read it in the flicker of the passing streetlights. "I need to be the kind of mother she can look up to." Out of the corner of his eye, Sal watched him fold it back up. Watched him hold it tight in his fist, his knuckles white, for the entire rest of the ride. Not a single word. By 4 a.m., my Giovanni was completely alone in his office, the heavy kind of alone. Slowly, he slid a photograph out from under his heavy leather ledger. It was the only thing in that entire building that had absolutely nothing to do with blood, or money, or territory. It was a picture of a little girl, a girl in a yellow dress with his exact haunting eyes. Sarah. He laid it gently on the mahogany desk. And then, he set Zinnia's note right next to it. He'd never let those 2 worlds touch before. Never. He just sat there, staring at them. And he wasn't crying. That detail? It matters. He was doing something so much harder. He was doing the math. He was calculating the actual, brutal cost of becoming a different man. The territory, the respect, the pure fear other men handed over to him like a Sunday offering. He'd spent 20 years building an identity out of iron and ice just to survive what happened to his family. And now, he was measuring exactly what it would take to tear it all down. He just sat there, feeling the crushing weight of it all. Then, his hand moved. He picked up the phone and dialed Eugenia. She was his father's old accountant, and honestly, the only breathing human being who had never, not once, told him what he wanted to hear. He asked her just one question. His voice was rough when he spoke. If a man wanted to start pulling back from the operations, slowly, carefully, over time, what would that look like? The line was quiet. So quiet, he actually thought she hung up. Finally, she let out a long, heavy sigh. It would look like the bravest thing you've ever done. He hung up the receiver without a word, but he didn't throw the note in the trash. Instead, he folded it back up carefully and slid it into his breast pocket, right over his heart, right next to the place where Sarah's memory had lived, untouched, for 11 long years. And then, Giovanni Rizzo just sat back in the dark, waiting for the sun to come up. Azaria was safe at her cousin Patrice's place, just for the 72 hours Giovanni demanded, which meant Zinnia's apartment was dead quiet. And I don't mean that peaceful, relaxing kind of quiet. I mean the kind of silence that actually rings in your ears. No cartoons blaring from the TV. No little voice begging for a glass of water, or stalling for just 5 more minutes before bed. Just the rattle of a cheap old refrigerator, a mug of tea going completely cold on the table, and a woman sitting alone, oh boy, with way too much space to think. People who don't have kids, they think silence is a vacation. But for a single mother, quiet is just the waiting room. It's where all the anxieties you've been desperately outrunning all day finally catch up to you. Zinnia sat there for a long time, just breathing it in. Her mind drifted back to her grandmother, Dolores, a tiny woman with hands that looked like they'd literally built houses. 6 days a week, Dolores scrubbed baseboards in Port of Spain, down on her knees for families who couldn't even be bothered to learn her last name. But on Sundays? On Sundays, she sang, huge, room-shaking notes, like she was clawing back every single ounce of dignity the week had tried to steal from her. Zinnia's own mother, Renata. She bolted when Zinnia was just 7. No screaming match, or no packed bags left by the door. She was frying eggs one morning, and the next day, she was a ghost. Zinnia waited 3 full days before her 7-year-old brain understood her mother wasn't coming back. Dolores didn't try to sugarcoat it. She didn't offer fake apologies for a daughter she couldn't control. She just pulled Zinnia onto her lap one night, looked her in the eye, and said, "Some people are built to hold on. Some are built to go. You better figure out which one you are." Zinnia figured it out right then. She built her entire life around that single lesson. The endless endurance, the absolute refusal to accept a handout, the way she could walk into a hostile room and let her face turn to stone. She'd spent her whole life convinced that not needing anyone was the exact same thing as being strong. But sitting there, unswallowed by the dark apartment, she started to wonder if she'd gotten Dolores's lesson wrong, because Dolores didn't just endure. Dolores danced. She laughed until her ribs physically ached. She let people in, and she never called that weakness. She called it the other half of staying alive. Then, her phone buzzed. It was Patrice. A massive guy in a dark sedan had slowly cruised past the house, 3 times since sundown. Zinnia didn't panic. She already knew exactly who had sent him. This right here? This is exactly where survival and the heart crash into each other. If you're here for characters who dig in and endure, instead of looking for the easy out. Hit that subscribe button. We're just getting into the deep water. Here's the terrifying thing about a boss like Giovanni Rizzo shifting his weight. Even just on a fraction of an inch, even behind locked doors, the streets, they feel the tremor long before anyone can actually name the earthquake. Sal felt it first. But then again, Sal had been holding up the counter at Marcello's every single Tuesday for 6 agonizing weeks, eating soup, leaving a $40 tip on a $12 tab. The rest of the waitstaff? They just thought he was a lonely guy with heavy pockets. But Zinnia knew exactly what it was. She never called him out on it. She just kept his water glass full, letting the heavy, suffocating silence between them act as a contract. One they prayed they'd never have to speak out loud. Ferris noticed second. And that's dangerous. Ferris had been Giovanni's right hand for 19 years. Dead eyes, tight mouth, a guy who never raised his voice, simply because he never had to ask twice. He noticed the two pulled operations. He clocked that hushed, closed-door summit with Eugenia. And he definitely noticed the way Giovanni handled the Corvin problem. It was too fast. Too vicious. It didn't smell like business anymore. It smelled like a man protecting something deeply, desperately personal. After a sit-down later that week, Ferris finally pulled Giovanni aside. He asked, in that flat, bone-chilling tone that made him so lethal, "Is there a situation we need to be aware of?" Giovanni just stared at him for one long, suffocating second. No. Ferris didn't push it. He wasn't the pushing type. He was a watcher. A guy who gathered loose threads and kept them hidden in his pocket until it was time to pull. He just nodded, walked out to the freezing parking lot, and made a quiet phone call to a guy on his own payroll. He just asked him to keep eyes on the bistro. Nothing loud, just a shadow. Later that same week, Ferris happened to catch Sal out in Marcello's parking lot right after his Tuesday soup run. Ferris didn't threaten him. He didn't make a scene. He just stopped right next to Sal in the biting cold, slowly lit a cigarette, and said, "Certain decisions carry weight for everybody, Sal, not just the man making them." Sal drove home that night. He didn't turn on the lights. He just sat at his own kitchen table, entirely in the dark. For the first time in 2 decades of unbroken, bleeding loyalty, he had to ask himself a question that made him sick to his stomach. If it ever came down to a war between Giovanni Rizzo and the empire Giovanni built, which side of the firing line was Sal actually standing on? He didn't have the answer yet. But the terrible truth? The fact that the question was even in his head meant the foundation was already cracking. Corvin Desch made his second fatal mistake on a Tuesday. His first was assuming a single mother like Zinnia didn't have any backup. His second? He forgot about Sal's Tuesday soup routine. By 11:40 a.m., 2 of Corvin's muscle walked right into Marcello's. They grabbed separate tables and didn't order a damn thing. Not for 20 minutes. It wasn't about making a scene. No, it was a classic intimidation play. Just taking up space. Heavy, silent. Letting a person know they're being watched until the watching itself becomes a threat. Stu took one look at them and practically sprinted to the back office. The other servers suddenly found a lot of prep work to do near the kitchen. Even the regulars felt it, that sudden drop in air pressure, and paid their tabs. Fast. Zinnia caught on the second she walked out of the back hallway. She knew exactly what they were. Growing up on the rougher edges of Crestfield teaches you how to read the room when men who don't belong suddenly show up. She just took a slow, deep breath and did what she always did when the ice started cracking. She kept moving. She took table 4's order, topped off the decaf at table 2, smiled at the lady by the window like it was just another Tuesday. But under that apron, Her hands were sweating, and her mind was frantically mapping out every single exit in the building. After her shift, she stood by her car in the lot for a minute, just staring. She thought about dialing 911, but she did the math, the exact same math she'd had to do her whole life. A black woman calling the Crestfield PD about two guys just sitting in a diner? That equation never ended well, and she knew it. So, she called Sal instead. He picked up on the second ring. She didn't ask to be rescued. She just laid out the facts, giving him the information because she trusted him to use it right. The line went dead quiet. Then, Sal's gravelly voice came through. Go straight home. Don't stop for gas. Don't stop for groceries. I'll call you when it's handled. What does handled mean? She asked, her voice tight. It means those two men get reassigned somewhere that isn't anywhere near you. She said okay. She drove home. She cooked Azaria's dinner, gave her a bath, read her 2 stories, and didn't let a single crack show on her face. Not one. But only when her little girl was dead asleep did Zinnia finally slide down the kitchen cabinets. She hit the cold linoleum and let her whole body just shake. 4 minutes. That was all she allowed herself. 4 minutes to fall apart. Then, she stood up, washed her face in the sink, and shut it down. The call came the very next morning. Sal didn't spell it out. Guys like him, they never do. He just told her, in that flat, deadpan voice of his, that the situation was resolved, and that she was clear to go to work. She said thanks. He said, don't mention it. And just like that, it was over. Corvin Desh was officially off the board. Zinnia just stood there in the middle of her kitchen, staring blankly at the wall, her knuckles white around the phone. See, this is the part of survival they don't warn you about. Surviving the actual, visceral danger, that's one thing. But the morning after? Waking up and realizing that a violent man just quietly reached into your life and erased a threat simply because he wanted to? And the worst part, realizing you're actually grateful for it? God, that messes with your head. She walked into Marcello's that morning and worked her shift like absolutely nothing had happened. She forced a smile for table 4, poured the coffee, and afterward she stood in the parking lot counting her tips, just like always, methodical, precise, smoothing out one crumpled bill at a time. The dollar amount was exactly the same as last Thursday, but somehow the money just felt different in her hands. Heavy, tainted, almost. That night, after finally getting Azaria down to sleep, she sat alone at the kitchen table. Just her, a pen, and a torn piece of scrap paper. She wasn't writing it for anyone to read. She just desperately needed to get the deafening noise out of her head. I met a man who could change everything, she wrote. I've met men like that before. But maybe the difference this time is he knows he has to change himself first. I just don't know if that's enough. She folded the paper up tight. So tight her fingers hurt. She opened the junk drawer by the fridge, the exact same spot where she used to keep that old note from Dario right before she finally burned it, and she tossed hers inside. 2 very different men. 2 entirely different types of collateral damage. One drawer. She was just sliding it shut when she heard it. Azaria come shuffling into the kitchen doorway in her little pajamas, dragging Biscuit by the ear. You know, 4-year-olds. They have a way of hitting you right between the eyes with absolutely no warning. Mama, she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. Is the man with the rabbit name coming back? Zinnia froze. Her blood turned to ice. Which man, baby? Azaria just rubbed her eye and sighed. The quiet one. He had sad eyes. But he was nice. Kids never realize when they've just dropped a bomb. That's exactly why it hit so damn hard. Zinnia scooped her up, holding her a little too tight, tucked her back into bed, and clicked off the lamp. She just stood there in the dark hallway for a long, long time, listening to the house settle around her, asking herself the exact same terrifying question her daughter had just answered. Giovanni Rizzo built his entire, blood-soaked empire on one very simple, unforgiving rule. Never hesitate. Hesitation? That's how you lose territory. It's how the guys standing right behind you start smelling weakness and doing the grim math in their heads. Giovanni was a man who made life or death calls between blinks, and he never lost a single night of sleep over them. Never. So, what he'd been doing quietly in the shadows for the past 2 weeks? God, his younger self would have put a bullet in his head for it. He'd been taking secret meetings with Eugenia, hush-hush sit-downs with a white-collar lawyer whose name wasn't anywhere near the Rizzo family ledgers. This was a guy who specialized in making massive, complicated, dirty empires slowly shrink into clean, legal portfolios. He wasn't tearing the house down yet. No, but he was checking the hinges on the exit door, and his hand was hovering right over the knob. Ferris caught wind of it on a Wednesday, and the fallout was immediate. He walked right into Giovanni's office and shut the door. He shut it with that dead quiet finality of a guy who already knows exactly how the argument ends. He didn't wait for an invite to sit. He just stood there, stared Giovanni down with cold eyes, and said, "Tell me what we're doing here." Giovanni gave him the stripped-down version. A woman. Returned money. He pointed a heavy finger to Sarah's picture and Zinnia's crumpled note. Just sitting there, completely exposed on the mahogany desk. Ferris looked at them, and man, you could practically see the gears jamming in his head. His expression was caught somewhere between absolute, gut-wrenching shock and a terrible, heartbreaking kind of understanding. The grandfather clock in the corner just ate up the heavy silence. Finally, Ferris leaned forward, his voice a low, desperate rasp. "You pull back, and the families are going to read it as the end. It's blood in the water, Gio. You know exactly what I'm telling you." "I do," Giovanni said, his voice quiet, heavy with the weight of it all. "Then you know what you're choosing." Giovanni didn't blink. Not once. "I'm starting to." Ferris walked out. He didn't say another word. He didn't have to. Giovanni just sat there, utterly alone. He let Sarah's photo and Zinnia's little crumpled note just rest there in the warm glow of the desk lamp. They weren't hidden. They weren't buried under blood money or ledgers. For the absolute first time in his entire life. He took a deep, trembling breath. Then he picked up the receiver and dialed Sal. "Ask her to meet me," Giovanni ordered, a fierce determination cracking through his exhaustion. "Somewhere she picks, neutral ground. No suits." Sal didn't ask a single question. He understood the gravity. He just said, "I'll make the call." She picked the park, not some high-end restaurant, or a neutral backroom where guys like Giovanni usually do their dirty work. She picked the patchy, uneven grass near the public library, the exact spot she took Azaria to feed the ducks every single Saturday, a place that just smelled like cut grass and damp earth. It was her turf, and she brought the kid. I chew on that detail a lot. She could have easily scrounged up a sitter, and she could have kept this mob boss a million miles away from the one thing in her life that actually mattered. But she didn't. Instead, she walked right up to one of the most dangerous men in Crestfield, holding a 4-year-old's hand and a crumpled paper bag full of bread crusts. That was the message, loud and clear, before anyone even opened their mouths. Giovanni showed up completely solo. No Sal, no muscle hanging back in the trees. He was just sitting there, on a rusted bench by the pond, wearing a coat that looked like it only cost a few $100, which, for him, was his version of blending in. When he saw them, he stood up. Azaria peeked at him from behind her mom's leg for a solid, agonizing 10 seconds. Then, decided he was boring, and marched straight toward the water. Zinnia stopped a few feet back, arms crossed tightly. She didn't look hostile. She just looked real, grounded. Giovanni didn't bullshit her. He gave it to her straight, the way he was, slowly, almost awkwardly, learning to do around her. He told her about the lawyer, Eugenia, the slow, grueling dismantling of his entire life. He wasn't asking for a medal, and he sure as hell wasn't asking her to wait around for him. He admitted, his voice rough, that he had absolutely no idea what kind of man would be left when the dust settled. He just knew that her note, it had knocked something loose inside him, and he was done trying to jam it back into place. Zinnia did what she did best. She let him talk, just letting the heavy silence hang in the air until it actually meant something. My grandmother used to say, "That a song only survives if someone keeps carrying it," she finally murmured. "I've been carrying mine by myself for a long time." She let out a long, shaky breath. "I'm not saying yes to you. I'm not saying I trust you. But I see what you're trying to do, and I think you actually mean it. That's more credit than I give most people." He took that in, just handled the words carefully, like he was holding fragile glass. Then, out of nowhere, Azaria waddled back from the pond. She marched right up to Giovanni, stared up at him with that heavy, dead serious judgment that only a 4-year-old possesses, and held out a crust of bread. Giovanni took it. He tossed it at the ducks. The birds lost their absolute minds over it, squawking and fighting in the water. Azaria thought this was the funniest thing in the history of the world. She laughed so hard, she fell backward right onto the grass. Zinnia watched her little girl laughing with this dangerous man, and for the first time, something in her face finally broke. The walls came down, just a fraction, and she didn't even try to put them back up. 3 months. That's how long it took after everything went down at the park. And then, Giovanni Rizzo just stopped wearing that coat. None of the guys said a word, obviously. You don't ask a boss questions. But they noticed. They felt it. They noticed it the exact same way they noticed he started showing up to sit-downs 5 minutes early, instead of making the room sweat and wait for him. He stopped letting those dark, whispered conversations happen in the back rooms. It was all small stuff. Quiet, almost invisible shifts. The kind of changes that don't announce themselves, but slowly redraw the borders of an entire room. Ferris handled the transition without ever needing an order. He steered the ship precisely. Like a guy who decided his loyalty to the family mattered more than his own discomfort with what the family was turning into. He just kept the gears greased and the machinery running, while something massive and slow shifted underneath them all. And Sal got put behind a desk. He bitched to everyone who would listen. He marched into Giovanni's office, practically spitting that it was the worst professional insult of his entire life. Giovanni? He didn't say a damn word back. But I swear to you, just for a fraction of a second, the corner of his mouth twitched, a ghost of a smile. And Zinnia. Pause. She was still at Marcello's. This isn't one of those fairy tales where the guy sweeps in, pays the rent, and the woman just forgets who she is. No. She was still clocking in at 6:47 a.m., still sweeping up tips, still checking on Azaria between the breakfast and lunch rushes. What changed was quieter than all that. Every Thursday morning, this guy, just a guy in a regular jacket, would walk in with 2 coffees from the bodega across the street. He'd sit at the corner table for the exact 7 minutes she had between sections. He didn't try to play hero. He didn't try to pay her bills. She wouldn't have let him anyway. He just showed up, week after week, consistency, no strings attached. In Zinnia's life, that was a brand new concept. One Thursday, before he even walked through the door, she found something waiting at the corner table. A small, framed photograph. It was a little girl in a yellow dress, with Giovanni's exact eyes. On the back, written in shaky pen, her name was Sarah. She deserved a woman like you in her corner. So does Azaria. I'm working on deserving one, too. Zinnia read it twice. Her breath hitched. She slipped it into her apron pocket and pressed her hand flat against it. It's exactly how you guard something precious, when you're terrified the world might take it away. She went back to work, and from that corner table, Giovanni Rizzo watched her weave through the diner, feeling something he hadn't felt in 11 years. He didn't look like a guy who had already lost everything. He looked like a man standing at the absolute edge of a decision. The most terrifying, dangerous kind of decision. Not because it might destroy him, but because, this time, it just might not. Look, you made it to the end. That means you sat through the pain, the dead silence, and the heavy tension right alongside these characters. Don't let this be the last emotional battle you witness. Hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you right back here for the next one.